The howl of a lone wolf cut through the Wyoming twilight as Grace Harper clutched her shawl tighter against the growing chill, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon where storm clouds gathered like an army preparing for battle. The year was 1878, and the promise of a new life that had drawn her west was beginning to feel like a cruel joke played by fate itself. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Grace hurried the last few steps to her modest homestead, a small cabin she'd purchased with every cent she'd saved during 5 years of teaching back in Boston. The life she'd imagined for herself on this wild frontier hadn't included being alone, but her husband of just 3 months had succumbed to pneumonia during their journey west, leaving her to face this untamed land on her own. "Come on, Penny," she called to her mare, leading the horse into the small stable attached to the cabin. The animal seemed nervous, sensing the approaching storm as Grace quickly set about securing the doors and windows of her home. Inside, she lit the lantern that hung from the central beam and stoked the dying embers in her cook stove. The cabin was simple, but sound. At least, she hoped it was sound enough to withstand whatever fury the skies were about to unleash. She had weathered 2 storms since arriving 3 months ago, but neither had carried the ominous weight of the one now bearing down on her homestead. Grace jumped at a sudden pounding on her door, her hand flying to her chest. Few travelers came this way, her cabin standing somewhat isolated between the small town of Riversbend and the larger settlement of Willow Creek. "Hello," called a deep voice from outside. "Anybody home? Storm's coming fast." Hesitantly, Grace approached the door, her father's old revolver in hand. "Who's there?" she called. "Name's Beau Hayes, madam. I was heading to Willow Creek when my horse threw a shoe. Saw your cabin and thought to ask for shelter until the storm passes." Grace took a deep breath. The proper thing would be to offer hospitality, but a woman alone had to be cautious. Still, she couldn't send anyone away to face what was coming. "I'm opening the door," she announced, keeping the revolver hidden in the folds of her skirt. "But I'll have you know I'm armed." When she swung the door open, she found herself looking up at a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face that spoke of years under the sun. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat, and his blue eyes regarded her with a mixture of respect and relief. A horse stood behind him, clearly favoring one hoof. "Thank you kindly, madam," he said, removing his hat. "I promise I mean no harm. Just need a place to wait out the storm." Grace nodded, stepping aside. "You can bring your horse around to the stable. There's room beside mine." As Beau led his limping horse away, Grace quickly tidied her small living space, pushing away the vulnerability she felt at having a stranger in her home. When he returned, stomping his boots at the threshold, the first fat raindrops were beginning to fall. "Obliged for your kindness, Mississippi." He left the question hanging. "Mrs. Harper." "Grace Harper," she replied, emphasizing her married status even though she no longer had a husband. "Mrs. Harper," he repeated with a respectful nod. "Looks like we're in for a bad one. Wind's picking up something fierce." As if to confirm his words, a gust rattled the windows, and Grace couldn't help but flinch. "I've been here 3 months," she said, moving to put more wood in the stove. "Haven't seen one this bad yet." "Wyoming territory can throw some mean weather," Beau said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Mind if I check your roof and shutters? Might be able to secure things a bit better before it really hits." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding. "That would be kind of you, Mr. Hayes." While Beau went outside to examine the cabin's exterior, Grace set water to boil for coffee and pulled out some bread and dried beef. The least she could offer was a meal in exchange for his help. When he returned, his hair was damp from the increasing rain. "Your north shutter was loose. Fixed it best I could, and checked your roof seems solid. Those pine logs are good and tight too. You should be all right." "Thank you," Grace said, gesturing to the small table. "Please sit. The coffee will be ready soon." As they sat across from one another, the storm truly began to rage. Wind screamed around the corners of the cabin, and rain lashed at the windows with growing fury. Thunder boomed overhead, making the cups on the table rattle. "Been traveling long?" Grace asked, trying to distract herself from the storm's wrath. "Couple weeks," Beau replied, accepting the coffee she offered. "Coming from Colorado. Heard there was work at the Thompson Ranch near Willow Creek." "You're a cowhand then?" "Yes, madam. Been working cattle since I was 15. Before that, I helped my pa with his blacksmith shop in Missouri until he passed." Grace nodded, about to respond when a particularly violent gust of wind shook the entire cabin. A loud crack from outside made her jump to her feet. "That sounded like," she began, but Beau was already moving to the door. "Stay here," he instructed, grabbing his hat and slipping outside into the howling wind. Grace waited anxiously, peering through the window into the near darkness, illuminated occasionally by flashes of lightning. When Beau returned, his expression was grim. "Large branch came down on your stable roof," he reported. "Made a hole about 3 feet across. Rain's pouring in, and your mare is spooked." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "Penny, we need to move both horses inside," Beau said, already reaching for his coat. "That stable roof could go completely if the wind gets under it." "Inside? But where?" "Right here," Beau said, gesturing to the main room of the cabin. "It's not ideal, but it's dry, and we can keep them calm." Grace didn't hesitate. Penny was her lifeline, her only means of traveling to town and working her small garden plot. Without the mare, she'd be truly stranded. Together, they battled the wind and rain to lead the frightened horses from the damaged stable into the cabin. It was a tight fit, the 2 horses taking up nearly half the small living space, but they managed to settle the animals against a far wall. "There," Beau said, breathing hard as he removed his soaked coat. "They'll be fine now." Grace pushed her wet hair from her face, suddenly aware of how improper the situation would appear to anyone back east, a widow alone in a cabin with a strange man and 2 horses. The thought almost made her laugh despite her anxiety. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said, handing him a blanket from her small chest. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come along." Beau nodded, accepting the blanket. "Just doing what anyone would do, Mrs. Harper." As the night wore on, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it grew more intense, with wind that threatened to lift the roof and thunder that shook the very ground. The horses grew increasingly nervous, whickering and stomping at each boom of thunder. "They need distracting," Beau said, moving to Penny's side and stroking her neck. "Same as people, really. Mind if I talk to them a bit? Helps keep them steady." "Please do," Grace said, relieved at his knowledge. Her own experience with horses was limited to the basics of care and riding. To her surprise, Beau began speaking to the horses in a low, melodic voice, almost like a bedtime story. He told tales of wide, open prairies and cool mountain streams, of star-filled skies and peaceful valleys. His deep voice seemed to soothe not just the animals but Grace as well, providing a counterpoint to the storm's chaotic symphony. "You have a way with them," she observed after a while, sitting on her small bed across the room. Beau smiled slightly. "My ma used to say I could talk the horns off a bull if I set my mind to it. Guess horses are easier." A sudden violent gust rocked the cabin, and one of the window shutters tore free with a splintering crack. Rain immediately began to spray through the opening, soaking the floor and table. "Stay with the horses," Beau shouted over the wind's howl, already moving toward the window. "Keep them calm." Grace hurried to the animals, stroking their necks and murmuring reassurances as she watched Beau struggle with the broken shutter. The wind was so strong it nearly pushed him away from the window, but he braced himself against the wall and managed to secure a blanket over the opening, tying it off to nails in the log wall. When he turned back, water streaming down his face, Grace could see a nasty cut on his cheek where something had struck him. "You're hurt," she said, leaving the horses to retrieve her small medical kit. "It's nothing," Beau insisted, but he sat when she pointed firmly to a chair. Grace cleaned the cut with water and a cloth, then applied some of the precious iodine she'd brought from Boston. His face was so close to hers as she worked that she could see the individual droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes and the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes. He smelled of rain and horses and something distinctly masculine that made her suddenly conscious of how long it had been since she'd been this close to a man. "Thank you," he said quietly when she finished, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her step back quickly. "Of course," she replied, busying herself with putting away her supplies. "It's the least I can do after all your help." Another crash from outside made them both turn. This time it sounded like something substantial had fallen nearby, perhaps another tree. "That was close," Beau observed, moving to check that his makeshift window covering was holding. "This is one of the worst storms I've seen in years." Grace nodded, trying to hide her growing fear. "Will it last all night, do you think?" "Probably," he answered honestly. "These prairie storms sometimes go on for days." The horses whinnied nervously, and Beau immediately returned to them, running his hands down their legs and checking for signs of distress. "They're doing all right, but they'll need water soon." Grace filled a bucket from her water barrel and brought it to the horses, watching as Beau helped them drink. There was something comforting about his calm efficiency, the way he seemed to know exactly what needed doing without panic or hesitation. As the night deepened, the storm continued its assault. The rain came in waves, sometimes lessening to a steady drumming on the roof before building again to a roaring deluge that threatened to drown out all other sounds. The wind moaned and shrieked around the cabin's corners, finding every crack and crevice to whistle through. Grace found herself growing increasingly weary, but sleep seemed impossible with the constant noise and her anxiety about the cabin's ability to withstand the storm's fury. She had just closed her eyes, leaning against the wall near her bed, when she felt the floor beneath her vibrate strangely. Beau noticed it too, his head snapping up from where he'd been checking his horse's injured hoof. "That's not good," he muttered, moving to the door and cracking it open to peer outside. "What is it?" Grace asked, joining him. "Water's rising," he said grimly. "Creek must have overflowed its banks." Grace felt her heart sink. Her cabin sat on a slight rise, but the creek that wound its way through her property was only about 100 yards away. If it was flooding? "How bad?" she managed to ask. "Can't tell exactly in the dark, but I can hear it rushing. We should move anything important up higher, just in case." For the next hour, they worked together to raise her most precious possessions, her books, documents, family photographs, and clothes onto shelves and her small table. Beau even helped her lift her mattress onto the table, creating a raised platform where they could sit if water did enter the cabin. All the while, he kept checking on the horses, making sure they remained calm despite the increasing sounds of rushing water outside. By midnight, they could clearly hear the creek, now a raging torrent, much closer to the cabin than it should have been. "It's still rising," Beau reported after another check outside. "Water's about 30 yards from the door now." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, trying to control her trembling. "What do we do if it reaches us?" "We stay calm," Beau said firmly. "This cabin's built solid. Worst case, we might get some water on the floor, but the walls will hold. Main thing is keeping the horses steady if that happens." Animals don't take well to standing in water, especially during a storm. As if to punctuate his words, both horses stamped nervously, sensing the danger even through the cabin walls. Beau immediately went to them, talking in that same low, soothing voice he'd used earlier. "Here," he said to Grace, gesturing her over. "They need both of us now. Just stand here by Penny's head and keep your hand on her neck. Let her feel your presence." Grace did as instructed, finding that the act of soothing the mare also helped calm her own nerves. Beau stood close beside her, one hand on his own horse and the other occasionally reaching over to help Grace guide Penny when the mare grew particularly restless. "That's it," he encouraged when Grace managed to settle Penny after a particularly loud thunderclap. "You've got a natural touch." "I've never been very good with animals," Grace admitted. "My husband was the one who knew horses. I was a schoolteacher back east." "A teacher?" Beau looked impressed. "What brought you out to Wyoming territory, if you don't mind my asking?" Grace hesitated, then decided there was little harm in sharing her story. "Edward, my husband, had consumption. The doctors said a drier climate might help his lungs. We sold everything to buy this homestead, but She swallowed hard. "He didn't make it through the journey. I decided to continue on alone." Beau's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Harper. That took real courage, coming all this way by yourself." "Grace," she said suddenly. "Please call me Grace. It seems silly to stand on formality when we're sharing a cabin with 2 horses during a flood." That drew a smile from him, transforming his weathered face. "Grace it is, then. And I'm Beau." A new sound suddenly joined the storm's cacophony, the gurgle and splash of water against the cabin's foundation. Grace's eyes widened in alarm. "It's reached us," Beau confirmed, moving to the door. When he opened it, water immediately began seeping under the threshold. "It's only an inch or so deep outside right now, but it's rising fast." Grace fought down panic as she watched the water begin to spread across her floor. "Will it come in much further?" "Depends on how much more rain falls and how high the creek gets," Beau answered honestly. "Best prepare for a few inches at least." The horses sensed the water and began to grow agitated, moving restlessly in their confined space. Penny whinnied sharply, trying to back away from the encroaching wetness. "Easy, girl," Beau soothed, moving to block her retreat. "Grace, we need to keep them in place. If they start moving around too much in this small space, they could hurt themselves or damage the cabin." For the next hour, they worked tirelessly to keep the horses calm as the water continued to rise, eventually reaching nearly 6 inches deep throughout the cabin. Grace's feet and the hem of her dress were soaked, but she hardly noticed, focused entirely on Penny and following Beau's quiet instructions. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, wind and rain battering the little cabin from all sides. Occasionally, they heard the crack of branches breaking or the thud of debris hitting the outer walls, but the sturdy log structure held firm against the onslaught. "You built this place well," Beau commented during a brief lull in the storm. "I didn't build it," Grace replied, "but the man who did knew what he was doing. His wife died in childbirth, and he couldn't bear to stay. Sold it to us for less than it was worth, I think." Beau nodded, his hand never ceasing its rhythmic stroking of his horse's neck. "Tragedy seems to follow folks out here sometimes. Land's beautiful but harsh." "Why do you stay?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. "In the West, I mean." Beau considered the question for a moment. "Freedom, I suppose. Room to breathe." After the war, everything back east felt too crowded, too confined. Out here, a man can make his own way, answer to himself. "You fought in the war." "Union cavalry," he confirmed. "Spent 3 years riding all over Virginia and Tennessee. When it ended, I couldn't go back to Missouri. Too many memories. Headed west instead, been working ranches ever since." Grace nodded, understanding his need for open spaces. Despite her current predicament, she'd felt something similar these past months, a sense of possibility that had been absent in her structured life in Boston. The water level inside the cabin seemed to stabilize as the night wore on, neither rising further nor receding. The horses had grown accustomed to standing in it, though they still startled at the louder crashes of thunder. As dawn approached, Grace found herself fighting exhaustion. She had been on her feet most of the night, and the constant tension had drained her completely. Beau noticed her swaying slightly where she stood. "You should rest," he said gently. I can watch both horses for a while. I couldn't possibly sleep, Grace protested, though her body screamed for relief. Just sit for a bit then, Beau insisted. On the table where it's dry. I'll wake you if anything changes. Too tired to argue, Grace carefully made her way to the table and perched on its edge, away from her stacked belongings. She intended only to rest for a few minutes, but found her eyelids growing impossibly heavy as she watched Beau with the horses, his tall figure a reassuring presence in the dim light of dawn. When she next opened her eyes, the quality of light in the cabin had changed. Rain still fell heavily, but the constant thunder had moved off, and the wind had diminished somewhat. Water still covered the floor, but it seemed slightly lower than before. Beau stood exactly where she had last seen him, one hand on each horse, his posture alert despite what must have been exhausting hours of vigilance. "Have you been standing there all this time?" Grace asked, her voice rough with sleep. Beau turned, offering a tired smile. Horses needed steadying. Storms moving off, but the water's been making them nervous. Grace slipped down from the table, wincing as her feet hit the cold water. "You should have woken me. You must be exhausted." "I've gone longer without sleep on cattle drives," he assured her, though the dark circles under his eyes told a different story. "Besides, you needed rest." Something about his selflessness touched Grace deeply. This stranger had spent the entire night protecting not just her horses, but her home and her safety, without complaint or expectation of reward. "Let me take over," she insisted, moving to stand beside him. "At least sit for a while." Beau hesitated, then nodded. "Just for a few minutes," he agreed, making his way carefully through the water to the table where Grace had been sleeping. As the morning progressed, the rain gradually lessened, and the water inside the cabin began to recede. By noon, only patches of dampness remained on the floor, though outside was a different story. When Grace cautiously opened the door to look, she was met with a transformed landscape. Her yard had become a shallow lake extending in all directions, with only the tops of fence posts and bushes visible above the muddy water. "Creek's gone back down some," Beau observed, standing behind her. "But it'll be a few days before this all drains away." "Days?" Grace turned to him in dismay. "But how will you get to Willow Creek? Your horse still needs a shoe." Beau shrugged. "I'll have to wait it out. If you don't mind me imposing on your hospitality a bit longer." Grace found herself surprisingly relieved at the thought of not being alone as the land recovered from the storm's ravages. "Of course you can stay. It's the least I can offer after all you've done." With the immediate danger past, they were able to move the horses back to the stable, where Beau made quick work of repairing the damaged roof with some spare lumber Grace had stored behind the cabin. The day was spent cleaning up debris, salvaging what could be saved, and taking stock of the damage. "All things considered, you got off lightly," Beau told her as they shared a simple meal that evening. "Main structure's sound, stables fixed, and your garden's mostly underwater, but should recover once it drains." Grace nodded, grateful for his positive assessment, but still somewhat overwhelmed by the work ahead. "I don't know how I would have managed without your help," she admitted. "I've never experienced anything like this storm." "First year's always the hardest," Beau said with understanding. "Gets easier as you learn the land's moods. Do you ever think of settling somewhere?" Grace asked, curious about this man who had spent so many years wandering from ranch to ranch. "Having a place of your own?" Beau was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Used to dream of it. A small spread with good water and enough cattle to make a living. But it takes money to start, and cowhand wages don't leave much for saving." "What about now? Do you still want that?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "More so these past few years. Gets lonely on the trail as you get older." Something in his tone made Grace look at him more closely. Despite his weathered appearance, she realized he probably wasn't much older than her own 26 years, perhaps early 30s at most. The hard life of a cowboy aged a man quickly. The following days fell into an unexpected rhythm as they worked together to restore order to Grace's homestead. Beau proved himself handy with repairs, fixing not just the stable roof, but several other small issues that Grace hadn't had the skill or strength to address on her own. As the floodwaters gradually receded, leaving behind a layer of mud and debris, Beau helped Grace salvage what remained of her garden and showed her how to identify which plants might recover. He fashioned a simple forge from rocks and repaired his horse's shoe himself, explaining that he'd learned the basics of blacksmithing from his father. In the evenings, they would sit on Grace's small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Their conversations gradually deepened, moving beyond the practicalities of frontier survival to shared histories and quiet dreams. Grace found herself looking forward to these talks, to Beau's low chuckle when something amused him, to the thoughtful way he considered her questions before answering. She began to notice small details about him, the way the corner of his mouth lifted slightly before he smiled fully, how his eyes crinkled when he was trying not to laugh, the gentleness of his calloused hands when he demonstrated how to mend a bridle or reset a fence post. On the fourth day after the storm, as they worked side by side clearing mud from her chicken coop, Grace realized with a sudden clarity that she was reluctant for him to leave. The thought brought her up short, her hands stilling in their task. "Everything all right?" Beau asked, noticing her pause. "Yes," she said quickly, resuming her work. "Just thinking about all that's left to do." "We're making good progress," he assured her. "Another day or two, and you'll be back in working order." "Another day or two." The words hung in the air between them, a reminder that his stay was temporary. Once the road to Willow Creek dried enough for travel, he would continue on his way, and she would be alone again. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one, Grace found herself speaking before she had fully formed the thought. "You could stay," she said softly. "If you wanted to." Beau turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "Stay. I mean," Grace hurried to clarify, heat rising in her cheeks, "there's plenty of work here. I've been meaning to expand the garden, maybe add a few cattle. I could pay you. Not much, but room and board, and whatever I can spare from selling eggs and vegetables in town." Beau was quiet for so long that Grace began to regret her impulsive offer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "That's a generous offer, Grace. But I wouldn't feel right taking charity." "It's not charity," she insisted. "It's an arrangement that would benefit us both. I need help and you need." "Well, you said yourself you're tired of wandering." "I did say that," he acknowledged. "But there's more to settling somewhere than just stopping. A man needs purpose, a future he can work toward." Grace nodded, suddenly embarrassed. "Of course. I didn't mean to presume." "You didn't," Beau said quickly, reaching out to briefly touch her hand before withdrawing again. "I'm honored by the offer. Truly. I just need to think on it." They sat in silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the night deepened around them. Eventually, Grace excused herself and went inside, leaving Beau alone with the stars and his contemplations. The next morning brought clear skies and the first real warmth since before the storm. Grace rose early, determined to maintain her composure regardless of Beau's decision. She had survived her husband's death and the journey west alone. She would manage whatever came next. She found Beau already outside, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by floating debris. He straightened as she approached, his expression serious. "Morning," he greeted her, setting aside his tools. "Thought we might talk about your offer, if that's all right." Grace nodded, trying to keep her face neutral. "Of course." Beau removed his hat, running a hand through his dark hair before replacing it. "I've been thinking hard about what you said. About staying on." "You don't have to," Grace began, but he held up a hand gently. "Please let me finish. I've spent nearly 10 years drifting from ranch to ranch, never putting down roots. Always told myself it was freedom, but lately—" He paused, looking out over the land that stretched beyond her cabin. "Lately I've been wondering if I've just been running from something instead of toward it." Grace waited, hardly daring to breathe. "I'd like to stay," Beau continued, meeting her eyes directly. "Not as a hired hand, though. I'd like to propose a partnership. I've got some savings, not much, but enough to buy a few head of cattle to start. We could build this place together, make it something more than either of us could manage alone." "A partnership," Grace repeated, turning the word over in her mind. "A business arrangement," Beau clarified. "To start with, at least. I'd build a small cabin for myself over by the south pasture, help expand the garden and livestock. We'd share the profits from what we sell. If it doesn't work out after a season, no hard feelings, I'll move on." Grace considered his proposal. It was sensible, practical, a frontier solution to frontier challenges. Two people working together stood a much better chance of success than either one alone. "I accept," she said, extending her hand formally. "Partners." Beau's smile broke across his face like sunrise as he took her hand in his much larger one. "Partners," he agreed, and Grace felt something warm and hopeful unfurl in her chest at the firm promise of his grip. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as they set their partnership in motion. True to his word, Beau began construction on a small cabin for himself about a quarter-mile from Grace's home, using lumber they purchased together from the sawmill in Riversbend. He traveled to Willow Creek and returned with 5 young heifers and a bull, the beginning of what they hoped would grow into a respectable herd. Grace found herself enjoying the shared work and decision-making after so many months of bearing every burden alone. Beau respected her opinions and offered his own without dominating, and together they developed plans for the homestead that were more ambitious than either would have attempted individually. As summer progressed into early autumn, Grace noticed subtle changes in their interactions. Their evening conversations on her porch grew longer, often stretching until the stars were thick overhead. Sometimes their hands would brush as they passed tools or dishes, and increasingly, neither was quick to pull away. When Beau smiled at her, which happened more and more frequently, Grace felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with their business arrangement. One evening in late September, as they sat shelling peas from their expanded garden, Beau cleared his throat in a way that Grace had come to recognize as a prelude to something he found difficult to say. "I've been thinking," he began, his fingers continuing their methodical work, "that cabin of mine is nearly finished." "Yes," Grace agreed, wondering where this was leading. "You've done remarkable work. It looks sturdy enough to withstand a dozen storms." "That was the idea," Beau said with a small smile. "After that night. Well, I wanted to make sure it could handle whatever Wyoming throws at us." The reference to the storm that had brought them together hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Neither had forgotten those hours of shared danger and vigilance. "Grace," Beau continued after a moment, setting aside his bowl of peas, "I need to say something, and I hope you'll hear me out." Grace's hand stilled, her heart suddenly racing. "I'm listening." "When I came here, I was just passing through, looking for work, same as I've done for years. I never expected—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I never expected to find something I wasn't even sure I was looking for." "And what was that?" Grace asked softly, though she hoped she knew the answer. "A place that feels like home," Beau said simply. "And someone who makes me want to stay, not just for a season but for good." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest, but she needed clarity. "As partners?" Beau met her eyes directly. "As more than partners, if you're willing. I know it hasn't been that long, and if you need more time, I understand completely. But I wanted you to know that my feelings for you have grown beyond friendship or business." Grace set her own bowl aside, her hands trembling slightly. "I was beginning to wonder if you felt the same way I do," she admitted. "I've been afraid to say anything," worried it might change things between us if you didn't share those feelings. And how do you feel? Beau asked, his voice low and intent. Instead of answering with words, Grace moved closer to him on the porch step where they sat. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if she had misunderstood, she leaned in until her lips met his in a gentle, questioning kiss. Beau's response was immediate and certain. His hand came up to cradle her cheek as he returned the kiss with tender thoroughness, as if sealing a promise between them. When they finally parted, his smile was brighter than she had ever seen it. "I take it that's a yes?" he asked, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. Grace laughed softly. "That's definitely a yes." In the weeks that followed, their relationship blossomed alongside their homestead. Beau continued to sleep in his new cabin, maintaining proprieties that Grace sometimes found frustratingly old-fashioned, but secretly appreciated for the respect they demonstrated. Their days were filled with shared work and planning, their evenings with increasingly intimate conversations and sweet, gradually deepening kisses. As November arrived, bringing the first biting chill of approaching winter, Beau rode into Riversbend one morning without explanation beyond business to attend to. When he returned that evening, he seemed both nervous and determined as he joined Grace for their usual supper. "Everything all right?" she asked, noticing his distraction as he barely touched his food. "Did something happen in town?" "Everything's fine," he assured her quickly. "Better than fine, actually. I just have something on my mind." After they had finished eating and cleaned up together, Beau suggested a walk despite the cold evening air. Wrapped in her warmest shawl, Grace accompanied him out under a sky ablaze with stars, their breath forming small clouds as they walked toward the creek now safely contained within its banks and bordered by frost-tinged grass. When they reached a spot overlooking the water, Beau turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I went to town today to speak with Reverend Thomas," he said without preamble. "And to buy this." From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band, holding it up so it caught the starlight. "Grace Harper," he continued, his voice steady despite the nerves evident in his eyes, "I love you. These past months have shown me what I want for my future, and that's a life built with you. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Grace felt tears spring to her eyes as joy welled up inside her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Beau Hayes, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground. When he set her down, his kiss was filled with promise and certainty, warming her despite the November chill. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Riversbend, with only a handful of neighbors and acquaintances as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress with wildflowers in her hair, and Beau looked almost transformed in a new suit, his face freshly shaved, and his eyes never leaving hers throughout the simple ceremony. That evening, as Beau carried her across the threshold of her cabin, now their cabin, as they had decided his would serve as a bunkhouse, when they eventually hired help, Grace felt a sense of rightness that had been absent from her life for so long. This marriage, unlike her first, began not with youthful idealism, but with tested partnership and proven devotion. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Beau murmured against her hair as he set her gently on her feet. "Our home," Grace corrected, reaching up to touch his face. "Built stronger than before." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters that Beau had reinforced after the storm. But inside, all was warmth and certainty as they began their life together, forged in adversity and strengthened by choice. Winter settled over the Wyoming territory with uncompromising intensity, bringing snow that drifted against the cabin walls and temperatures that made the air itself seem brittle. But inside, Grace and Beau created a haven of warmth and shared purpose. Their days fell into comfortable rhythms, tending the cattle in the sturdy barn they had built together, maintaining the homestead against winter's assault, planning spring plantings, and dreaming of expanding their herd when the snows melted. In the evenings, They would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Grace's small library of books, sometimes simply talking of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Grace taught Beau to read more fluently, and he showed her how to play checkers, both of them competitive enough to make each game a spirited contest. At night, they discovered each other with tender exploration and growing passion, their initial shyness giving way to an intimacy that deepened with each passing week. Grace found in Beau's arms a sense of belonging she hadn't known was possible, while he marveled at the gift of her trust and love after so many years of solitary wandering. December brought their first Christmas together, celebrated simply but joyously. Beau surprised Grace with a rocking chair he had secretly crafted in his old cabin, working on it during odd hours when she thought he was tending to the livestock. Grace presented him with a fine new saddle blanket she had woven on her small loom, embroidered with his initials. "Next Christmas will be even better," Beau promised as they sat before the fire that night, Grace rocking gently in her new chair. "We'll have more to celebrate, if all goes well with the spring calving." Grace smiled, her hand moving unconsciously to her abdomen. "I think we might have even more to celebrate than that," she said softly. Beau's eyes widened as her meaning registered. "Are you saying?" "I can't be certain yet," Grace cautioned, "but I'm almost 2 months late, and I've been feeling different. Tired in the mornings, certain smells bothering me." Beau was on his knees beside her chair in an instant, his hands covering hers. "A baby," he whispered, awe and joy mingling in his voice. "Our baby. If I'm right, it should arrive in summer," Grace said, her own happiness tempered slightly by natural anxiety. "I know childbirth out here can be dangerous." "We'll be prepared," Beau promised firmly. "I'll make sure Dr. Whitaker from Willow Creek is available. And Sarah Jensen from the next homestead over has midwifed dozens of births. You and our child will have every care possible." His certainty reassured her, as it had since that first stormy night when he had calmly faced down danger to protect her home and horses. In Beau's steady presence, Grace found the courage to embrace this new adventure with hope rather than fear. As January gave way to February, Grace's condition became certain. Her body changed subtly at first, then more noticeably as the baby grew within her. Beau watched these changes with a mixture of wonder and protectiveness, taking on more of the physical labor around the homestead despite Grace's insistence that she remained capable. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she would protest when he tried to prevent her from carrying water or lifting feed sacks. "Humor me," Beau would reply with that smile that still made her heart quicken. "Let me fuss a little. I've waited a long time for this family. I intend to take good care of you both." By March, the worst of winter's grip had loosened, and the first hints of spring began to appear across their land. New calves arrived, wobbling on spindly legs beside their mothers, and Beau declared each successful birth good practice for their own impending arrival. April brought heavy rains that swelled the creek once more, but the improvements they had made to the homestead diverting part of the stream's flow and building up the ground around the cabin prevented any serious flooding. Still, as thunder rolled across the sky one particularly fierce night, Grace found herself remembering the storm that had first brought Beau to her door. "Thinking about that night?" Beau asked, noticing her gaze fixed on the window as lightning illuminated the darkness outside. "How did you know?" Grace asked, turning to him with a smile. "You get a certain look when you're remembering," he said, moving to sit beside her on their bed. "And storms always seem to take us both back there." "I was so frightened," Grace admitted. "Not just of the storm, but of being alone with a stranger. And then those horses in the cabin." She laughed softly at the memory. "I knew I was in trouble when I saw you standing there with that revolver, looking so determined despite being terrified," Beau said, taking her hand. "Thought to myself, this woman has more courage than sense, opening her door during a storm like this." "It wasn't courage," Grace countered. "It was necessity. I couldn't have turned anyone away to face that weather, not even a complete stranger. That's exactly what courage is, Beau insisted. Doing what's necessary despite your fear. His hand moved to rest gently on her rounded belly. Same as you're doing now, facing childbirth far from the comforts of your Boston home. Grace covered his hand with her own, feeling the baby shift beneath their joined touch. I'm not afraid, not really. Not with you here. As spring bloomed fully across the land, their homestead flourished with new life and activity. The garden Grace had expanded last fall yielded its first early vegetables, the cattle grew fat on fresh grass, and the chicken coop Beau had rebuilt after the flood was filled with clucking hens and a steady supply of eggs. They hired a young man named Thomas from Riversbend to help with the increasing workload, especially as Grace's advancing pregnancy limited her ability to handle certain tasks. He took up residence in Beau's original cabin, proving himself hardworking and responsible. By June, Grace was heavy with child, her movements slowed but her spirits high as she prepared for the baby's arrival. She sewed tiny garments in the evenings while Beau crafted a cradle from pine wood, his hands moving with surprising delicacy for a man accustomed to rougher work. Do you think it will be a boy or a girl? Grace asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the summer sunset paint the sky in brilliant orange and pink. A girl, Beau said without hesitation. With your eyes and spirit. And if it's a boy? Then he'll have your intelligence and compassion, Beau replied with a smile. Either way, this child is blessed to have you as a mother. Grace leaned against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. And you as a father. I never imagined this life would be possible when I was alone after Edward died. I thought I would simply survive out here, not truly live. Sometimes the best futures are the ones we never planned, Beau said, his arms circling her shoulders. I certainly never planned to get caught in a storm and end up with a wife, a home, and a child on the way. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, a sound that had become common around their homestead, a marker of how far they had traveled from those first cautious days of partnership. The baby arrived on a clear July morning, after a night of labor that left Grace exhausted but triumphant. Sarah Jensen from the neighboring homestead served as midwife, her calm efficiency guiding Grace through the most difficult hours until finally, as dawn broke over the eastern hills, their daughter announced her arrival with a lusty cry. She has your lungs, Sarah joked as she placed the swaddled infant in Grace's arms. And her papa's dark hair, looks like. Beau, who had been pacing outside for hours, was called in to meet his daughter. The expression on his face as he first beheld the tiny, red-faced bundle in Grace's arms was one Grace knew she would remember until her dying day, a mixture of awe, adoration, and humility that transformed his features. She's perfect, he whispered, carefully sitting on the edge of the bed and extending one finger for the baby to grasp in her tiny fist. What shall we call her? They had discussed names but hadn't settled on one, wanting to see their child before deciding. Now, looking at the small face with its determined expression, Grace knew. Eleanor, she said. It means bright light, because that's what she is, the light that came after the storm. Eleanor Hayes, Beau tested the name, his voice thick with emotion. It's beautiful, like her mother. Sarah discreetly excused herself, leaving the new family to their private joy. When the door closed behind her, Beau carefully stretched out on the bed beside Grace, one arm around her shoulders, his other hand gently touching their daughter's cheek. Thank you, he said simply, pressing a kiss to Grace's temple. For what? She asked, leaning into his embrace despite her exhaustion. For everything. For letting me in that stormy night. For offering me a place to stay. For loving me. His voice caught. For our daughter. Grace turned her face to meet his kiss, then looked down at Eleanor, already sleeping peacefully between them. Thank you for staying awake through that storm, she murmured. For holding me steady when I was afraid. for building this life with me." Outside, a summer breeze rustled through the cottonwoods that lined the creek, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. Inside, the family that had begun with a desperate knock on a cabin door during a raging tempest rested in the quiet certainty of love that had weathered its own storms and emerged stronger for the journey. 5 years passed, bringing changes both expected and surprising to the Hayes homestead. Eleanor grew from a determined infant into a spirited young girl with her father's dark hair and her mother's thoughtful eyes. She was joined by a brother, William, born 2 years after her, and the family that had started in a storm-battered cabin expanded to fill a larger home that Beau and Grace built together as their prosperity increased. Their cattle operation had grown from those first few head into a respectable small ranch, providing enough income to hire 2 permanent hands besides Thomas, who had stayed on and become almost like family. Grace's garden had evolved into a productive farm plot that supplied not only their needs but produced enough excess to sell in town, her teaching background proving useful in keeping meticulous records and managing their growing enterprise. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Beau surprised Grace by arranging for Eleanor and William to stay with Sarah Jensen for the night, giving them a rare evening of privacy. He prepared a special dinner, his cooking skills having improved considerably under Grace's patient instruction, and presented her with a silver locket containing tiny portraits of their children that he had commissioned from a traveling photographer in Willow Creek. "It's beautiful," Grace said, touching the delicate engraving on the silver surface. "I'll treasure it always." "Open it," Beau urged, an unusual nervousness in his manner. When Grace did, she found a small folded paper tucked behind the portraits. Carefully extracting it, she unfolded what appeared to be a deed. "What's this?" she asked, scanning the formal language. "The Thompson place," Beau explained, referring to a neighboring property that had been vacant since old Mr. Thompson had died the previous winter. "I've been negotiating with his son in Cheyenne. It's ours now, an additional 160 acres, including that stand of timber we've always admired and the northern pasture that connects to our land." Grace looked up at him in astonishment. "How did you manage this?" The Thompsons were asking a fortune for that property. "Not as much as you might think," Beau said with a hint of pride. "And we've done well these past years. Between the cattle sales and your vegetables, plus that contract to supply beef to the army post." He shrugged. "I wanted to build something that would last, something to pass on to Eleanor and William someday." Grace felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized how far they had come from those early days of cautious partnership. "You've given me so much more than I ever dreamed possible," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "A home, a family, a future." "We built it together," Beau reminded her, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "Every bit of it, from that first night when you trusted a stranger during a storm." Later that evening, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Grace's head resting on Beau's chest and his fingers gently combing through her hair, she reflected on the unexpected path her life had taken. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if your horse hadn't thrown that shoe during the storm?" she asked. "If you had made it to Willow Creek instead of stopping at my cabin?" Beau was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling in her hair. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I might have worked that ranch job for a season or 2, then moved on as I always did, never knowing what I was missing. And I would have faced that storm alone," Grace murmured. "Probably lost Penny when the stable roof collapsed. Maybe even lost the cabin to the flood." "Life turns on such small moments," Beau said, resuming the gentle stroking of her hair. A thrown horseshoe, a knock on a door during a storm, a widow brave enough to offer shelter to a drifter, a cowboy who stayed awake through the night just to hold her horses steady, Grace added, smiling at the memory. "Who would have thought that would lead to all this?" "I'm just grateful it did," Beau said, pulling her closer. "Every day, I'm grateful." Outside their window, stars wheeled across the Wyoming sky, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning 5 years earlier. The creek that had nearly destroyed their home now flowed peacefully within its banks, tamed by the channels Beau had dug and the willows Grace had planted along its edges. On the horizon, where storm clouds had once gathered with such menace, only the silhouette of mountains broke the clear night sky, a reminder of the vastness of the land they had claimed as home and the enduring strength of what they had built together, not just in timber and stone, but in trust and love. In the quiet of their room, with the future stretching before them as wide and promising as the western plains, Grace Hayes fell asleep in her husband's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together just as they had from the very beginning.